Welcome back to Metflex and Chill. This is your host, Rachel Gregory, and I have another solo Q&A episode for you today. I don't know why I am elongating my words. Is that even a thing? Also, do I have to introduce myself like that now that it's been, 2 months? I feel like everybody knows my name by now, but I guess if you are new to this podcast, then maybe you don't, so I'm just going to probably keep doing it. Anyway, so today we have a bunch of questions, and I guess I'll just dive right in. There's always great questions. All of you always ask phenomenal questions. So yeah, let's just dive right in and get started. So the first question, thoughts on butter and MCT oil in coffee for breakfast when trying to lose body fat? All right, this is a question I get a lot, especially if you are new to kind of following a keto diet or low carb diet or whatever you want to call it. So my main question back to you would be, what is your goal with adding this to your coffee, right? So we always have to think, okay, what's the goal of, always think, what's the goal of whatever we're doing, right? What are our current goals? And then what are the things that we're doing to help us work towards that goal? So what's your goal with putting MCT oil and butter in your coffee? Are you doing it just because you heard, through some other podcast or on Dr. Google that adding MCT oil and butter to your coffee would make you, quote unquote, burn body fat? Or are you doing it because maybe it makes you feel energized in the morning? Are you doing it because it helps you to push off your eating window, maybe like further into the day? Are you doing it because it fills you up? So you have to think back to what the goal is, because obviously you're saying with this question, your goal is to lose body fat. So is putting butter and MCT oil in your coffee helping you to work towards that goal, right? So is it filling you up? It's liquid calories. Butter and MCT oil are very high calorie foods, and we have to realize that to lose body fat, we need to be in some sort of energy or calorie deficit. So does adding butter and MCT oil to your coffee bring you closer or further away from that? Everyone's different in how they get filled up and how they, adhere to their specific caloric intake for the day. So I would say that if adding MCT oil and butter to your coffee, helps you to adhere to your overall daily intake, and I'm talking about overall daily caloric intake, food intake, by potentially pushing off your eating window. So if you consume MCT oil and butter in your coffee in the morning, and that helps keep you full until lunch, and then you can consume a bigger lunch and a bigger dinner while staying within your allotted calorie goal for that, then definitely do it. If it is something that you are, just adding to your coffee because you heard that it helps you, quote unquote, burn your own body fat because you're, adding fat, then I would say that's probably the wrong way to look at it, because again, butter and MCT oil are very, very calorie dense, and those calories count. Like, just because they are, maybe part of a bulletproof coffee, it doesn't mean that the calories and the energy just disappears in your body, right? MCT oil and butter are very calorie dense. I would also think about how much you're putting in your coffee. So I'll give you just a little bit of my strategy about how I use, we would call it bulletproof coffee. That's generally what it's called when you're putting, butter or MCT oil or coconut oil or whatever may be in your coffee. It's generally called bulletproof coffee. So the way that I use it in my own personal life is, first of all, I don't use MCT oil just because for me, it upsets my stomach a little bit and I just don't feel like I get anything from the oil. For some people, they notice that it helps with a lot of mental clarity and focus, which is something I'm going to talk about in a second. But for me, MCT oil just upsets my stomach. So I actually prefer MCT powder. And so I use this, I do add some MCT powder to my coffee in the morning to help with that mental focus and clarity. But I also use it as an adherence tool too. So when I say that, I mean that it helps me to, like I said, push my personal eating window out so I can consume bigger meals later on in the day, which helps me to adhere to my overall intake for the day. So if I'm, intermittent fasting, I'm going to add a little bit of MCT powder or maybe a little bit of heavy cream to my coffee. And that helps bring me to lunch without feeling, hunger. I don't really enjoy consuming black coffee. So I like to add a little bit of that to it. So that just helps with adherence. And then I do also get a little bit of that mental boost from having some of that MCT in my coffee. MCT stands for medium chain triglyceride. So I have the MCT powder. Like I said, I don't like the oil. Also, the powder adds a little bit of flavor. So I like to use, my favorite is Perfect Keto MCT powder. They have a really good salted caramel and chocolate flavor. So that just adds like creaminess to my coffee and flavor. So that's why I use the MCT powder and not just the oil. It also mixes in a lot easier and you don't have to blend things up and, feel like you're kind of drinking oily coffee. So that's my perspective on it. I would say that you just need to, again, think about how it helps you to adhere to what your daily intake is, right? So again, we need to be in some type of calorie deficit or energy deficit to lose body fat. And if you are just adding tablespoons of butter and MCT oil to your coffee and you're not keeping track of that, then that's probably going to be a lot of extra calories adding up throughout the day. And it's going to, kind of inhibit you from reaching your goal if you're not tracking those calories or if you're not paying attention to it. And then also if it's not filling you up, if you're drinking a huge cup of coffee with like a bunch of tablespoons of butter and MCT oil on top of having a big breakfast, then that's just going to be a lot of fat and a lot of calories in general. So it just all comes back to, what makes you feel good, what helps you to adhere to your daily intake. And then also we have to think about too, like butter and MCT oil butter does have some nutrients to it, but if you're continuously replacing, meals like breakfast and lunch and things like that with just coffee with butter and MCT oil, you're probably not getting a good amount of nutrients. Whereas if you were to consume, like some eggs and avocado and whatever it may be for breakfast or lunch or whatever, you're going to get a lot more nutrient density out of those foods than you are from MCT and butter and coconut oil. And that will in itself help to make you feel better and fill you up. And so long story short, I would say just think about what helps you most adhere to your intake for the day, what makes you feel the best, and play around with things. And also realize that like you don't have to be putting tablespoons of butter and MCT oil in your coffee. You could put like a teaspoon and still get the same effect. So I put usually, if I'm putting MCT powder in my coffee, I only do like a half a scoop, usually half a scoop or, 1 scoop sometimes, but I only do a little bit. And then also, also sometimes I use, or recently I've been using the super creamer. What is it called? The Super Coffee is a brand, and it's a super creamer. I think that's what it's called. And that does have MCT oil in it, but it's combined with a little bit of whey protein powder, and it doesn't feel like you're just drinking MCT oil. It actually is like creamy, so it's more of a heavy cream or half and half consistency. So I guess I lied, and I do consume MCT oil, but it's not just straight MCT oil. It's in it's a smaller amount and it's combined with other stuff. So it's more of that, adds that creamy texture, which I do enjoy in my coffee. So that I literally just forgot that that's what I drink every morning. And I guess it does have MCT oil in it. So ignore what I initially said when I first started answering this question, but hopefully that made sense. And yeah, just always think back to what makes you feel good, what allows you to adhere to your current intake, what fills you up. If you don't get filled up by liquid calories, then probably not a good idea to replace meals with, probably not a good idea to add tons of extra fat calories to your coffee and consuming them as liquid. I'd much rather you be eating your food and getting more nutrients from those foods. And yeah, so hopefully that answered your question. Sorry, it was a little roundabout way of answering that. All right, let's go to the next question. what is the best way to start implementing carbs into your diet if you've been keto? So I actually did a whole episode on how to implement carbs depending on your goals. So I will link that episode in the show notes. It's called Carb Ups, Carb Cycling and Building an Anti-Fragile Metabolism. But I would recommend, I guess, just starting off, I would start by incorporating them maybe around your workout. So, maybe an extra 15 to 20 grams pre-workout or post-workout, see how you feel and adjust from there. So everyone's different, but I would say that would probably be my first, or I would probably recommend that as the first place around your workouts. The next way that I would recommend incorporating them would probably be with like a 1-day carb up. So 1 day per week carb up. So for example, if you're at like 50 grams of total carbs per day, you can maybe try bumping that up to, 120, 150 grams. And then also obviously lowering the fat a bit so that you're staying within your intake. And that would be 1 day per week. And these are just a few examples of how I incorporate them for myself and for my clients. So when you're increasing carbs and, trying to stay within your calorie goal, I would say you definitely want to lower your fat and keep protein where it's at. So when you're increasing your carbs, you definitely don't want to decrease your protein. Protein should pretty much stay stagnant, especially, if you're tracking and whatever your specific goal is. It actually doesn't really matter what your goal is. I really think that protein is very important and should always be pretty high in my opinion, but I won't dive into all of that right now. But anyway, with that being said, if you are increasing carbs, you're probably going to want to decrease fat a little bit. And then always start with whole food carbs. So think, if you are trying to incorporate more carbs into your diet, if you've been keto for a while, like you said, obviously you're probably having some vegetables and non-starchy vegetables and things like that already. So incorporating whole food carbs that are a little bit more starchier to try out, especially like pre and post workout. I would probably recommend sticking with fruit, potatoes, squash, and rice. Those would be like my top 4 carb sources that are whole food carbs that are the starchier ones. Obviously, these are what we're talking about. We're not talking about like the non-starchy veggies. So start with those. And again, everybody is different and everybody, is coming from a different place. So it really just depends where you're coming from, what makes you feel good. And then also just tracking it, right? Track how much you're consuming, how you feel, what you're consuming, all of that, and play around with it. It takes time to kind of figure out what works for you, but I would definitely check out that all about Carb Ups episode. Sorry, it's called Carb Ups, Carb Cycling and Building an Anti-Fragile Metabolism. I will link that in the show notes again, so you can check that out and maybe pick one of those strategies depending on what your goals are and where you're coming from. All right, next question's pretty related to the last question. What is your opinion on targeted keto? So that targeted keto just means incorporating carbs around your workout, just like I mentioned before. I personally think it's a great tool and I do use it myself. So for example, pre-workout, you would, like I said, you would start by incorporating maybe 15 to 20 grams pre-workout, see how you feel. It could give you, just that extra boost of energy. I actually talk all about pre-workout nutrition and implementing not just carbs, but other things as well in an episode that I did. I guess it was like 2 months ago now, but I will link that one in the show notes. It's, I forget what it's called, but I'll link that episode in the show notes. I talk all about, pre-workout nutrition and incorporating carbs, how to do it, what to look for, and things like that. So definitely check that out. And then in terms of post-workout carbs, so they can be very beneficial as well. And again, we're talking about, working out, right? Targeted keto is really geared around people who are working out multiple times a week. So you're incorporating carbs pre and post workout. Really doesn't matter what type of workout. I think that it can be beneficial for any type of strength training, endurance, whatever it may be, just based off my experience. So in terms of post-workout implementation of carbs, that can actually be beneficial because it can help aid in recovery. One of the main things is when you do Obviously consume carbohydrates, you're spiking insulin, especially if they are starchier carbs. And when you spike insulin, this can actually help to bring cortisol down. And so we know that cortisol is our stress hormone, and cortisol and insulin are kind of opposite. So again, when you spike insulin, it can help to plummet cortisol. And this can help, especially after a workout, to get you back into that parasympathetic state. So when you're working out, you're in a sympathetic, or, it's more so referred to as the flight or fight mode. And so after your workout, you want to get more into that recovery mode, which would be more of that rest and digest mode, which is the parasympathetic state. So decreasing cortisol can help you get into that parasympathetic state, especially if you think about, if you're going to sit down to your post-workout meal. I always like to wait, at least 30 minutes after I work out to even consume anything, just because I want to make sure that my body's in that rest and digest mode before I consume anything. Because if it's not, then it's going to be a lot harder for your body to absorb the nutrients that you're actually consuming from your food. So I would always keep that in mind as well. So yeah, that's just a quick tip. And then also just thinking about, post-workout, your muscles are actually generally more insulin sensitive, which just means that they can kind of suck up all those carbs that not all those carbs, but they can suck up the carbs that you're consuming and replenish your muscle glycogen stores post-workout versus if you were to consume those at a different time throughout the day. So that's just something to think about as well. Our muscles, obviously, once we work them, they become more sensitive and ready to basically, just like I said, suck up all the nutrients that you're giving to your body. So post-workout is a good time to incorporate some carbs for those reasons. So yeah, I would definitely check out that episode that I did when I talked about the pre-workout nutrition. And I did talk a little bit about post-workout nutrition too, but maybe I'll do another episode that's just geared toward post-workout nutrition. So if you're interested in that, let me know and I will do that as well. And hopefully that answered your question. Okay, next question. Going from carnivore back to eating carbs, which would you recommend with the least bloat? Okay, so I actually just did a deep dive into veggies and bloating in the solo episode I did, I believe it was 2 weeks ago. So again, I will link that episode in the show notes. It starts with veggies and bloating. I think that's the beginning of the title. So I'll link that in there. So but just to kind of reiterate, if we're talking about non-starchy carbs that cause the least bloat, the main ones I will just list out here for you. And I talk about these more in that episode, but those would be probably bell peppers, bok choy, cucumber with the skin removed, cooked down spinach, zucchini, squash, and asparagus. Those are the ones that I would say, just from experience for myself and working with other people, that those cause the least bloat for most people. And then when we're talking about incorporating like starchier carbs, I would say those actually cause even less bloat. So things like, well, again, it depends on the person too, but usually things like white rice, potatoes, sweet potatoes, things like that, fruit, those don't tend to cause too much bloating. Some people can experience bloating from them, but in general, those are very easy to digest starchier carb sources. So I would say if you're starting back to implement carbs, and you're looking for starchier carbs, I would go for those. Again, incorporating them around your workout would probably be the best time to start to implement them back into your diet, especially if you're going from carnivore. But again, everyone's different. So I guess I would say, you just have to test and assess for yourself. And then also just don't incorporate so many different ones at once. I would, try introducing one source at a time, taking some notes on how you feel, and then incorporating other ones. So that's probably the best way to weed out too many variables at once. And those would be my recommendations. Okay, next question. What's the difference between a Carb Up and a refeed? Oh, sorry. Wait, no, that's not the question. Oh, no, it is the question. Okay, what's the difference between a Carb Up / refeed, and a diet break? Do I increase carb ratio for a diet break? Okay, so this is a two-part question. So I actually I'm referring back to a lot of episodes in this episode just because a lot of these questions refer to things that I've already done really deep dives into. So I don't want to repeat myself, but I'm going to link all of those episodes in the show notes. So if you ask this question or you're interested in learning more about one of the things that I talk about specifically, then definitely go check out one of those episodes. Again, I'll link everything in the show notes. If you're listening to on iTunes, you just swipe up and you can view those. And you can also go to my blog, and all of the episode show notes are up on the blog as well. So for this question, I do go into detail on the differences between diet breaks and refeeds in a previous episode I did a while back. So I will link that in the show notes. I forgot what it's called, but I'll link it in there. It'll be titled Diet Break and Refeed episode. But overall, the main reason to take diet breaks or refeeds when you're dieting is to basically just give your mind and body a break from the stress of dieting. So they can help reduce both the physical and the psychological fatigue that comes from being in a deficit, and also potentially offset some of the negative kind of hormonal and metabolic adaptations that do occur from dieting and from being in a deficit. It can also, from my experience, it allows most people to adhere to the diet for a longer period of time, rather than, embarking on a kind of a crash diet. You're actually doing things strategically. You have a plan and you're implementing these refeeds and diet breaks for a specific reason. And so I guess I'll dive into them a little bit just here. And then again, if you want to learn more about those, go back to that episode that I'll link in the show notes. But in terms of a refeed, it's typically a 1 to 3 day period of basically eating at maintenance calories. And the main benefit of a refeed, or the main benefits of a refeed, is mostly the psychological benefits of it. So again, just giving your mind a break from dieting. And then also another benefit is refilling muscle glycogen stores. So if you are consuming more calories and more carbohydrates within that refeed, which I'll talk about in a second, you'll be able to refill those muscle glycogen stores more than if you were just continuing in a linear deficit and didn't have, that refeed. So hopefully that makes sense. One-day refeeds are mostly just, again, an adherence tool or a mental or psychological break. Whereas if you're doing a 2 to 3 day refeed or more, which would be considered a diet break, which I'll talk about in a second, those may have slightly more physiological impacts, but really a refeed day is more so, it has that psychological impact. 2-day refeeds and beyond can potentially start to have more of a physiological impact with your hormones, more than that psychological impact. But really refeeds, and just based off the research and anecdotal evidence and things like that, and my experience for myself and with clients, it's really just that psychological break. And then also you want to think about refeeds. You're structuring these refeeds into your diet. So they are actually, included in your weekly caloric intake. That's generally how you're supposed to implement refeeds, or not supposed to, but that's generally how people do. And this means that even with that, higher calorie day or days that you have, your weekly caloric total balance is still in a deficit. So it's still going to lead to continued progress and fat loss, right? So you're still in that weekly caloric deficit, but you're kind of manipulating your intake so that 1 day out of the week or 2 days out of the week, you have a higher amount of calories versus doing more of like a linear intake throughout the entire week. And then lastly, with a refeed, you also have to realize a refeed is not a cheat day or like a free day. You can't just, especially if you want to hit your goal sooner than later, you can't just eat whatever you want and kind of look at it as a free day or a cheat day. A refeed is there for, a specific reason and a strategic reason. So you should go into it with a strategy and still consume the specific foods that you've been consuming, just maybe in a greater quantity. And then also we can, in that episode that I'll link below, I talk about consuming carbs for your refeed versus, upping your protein or fat. I dive into that in the previous episode. I don't remember what it's called. I'll link it in the show notes, but I'm not going to dive too far into that right now, but that's just something to think about as well. So then when we're talking about a diet break, so diet breaks are typically 3 days or more, and even up to 14 days. That's kind of the typical range, between 3 and 14 days. Between 3 days and 2 weeks of, again, bringing your calories back up to maintenance intake. And we also have to realize that this is your new intake, like your new maintenance intake. So I talked about this in that other episode, but thinking about, if you're dieting and you're losing weight, especially if you are heavier and you have a lot of weight to lose, say you lost like 30 pounds and you're taking your first diet break, your maintenance intake is not going to be what it was when you were 30 pounds heavier. And there's reasons for that, right? Like, you are a smaller person. The main reason is you're a smaller person. So it takes less energy for you to maintain that smaller body. So you're going to have a decrease in the amount of calories that you consume to maintain that new, leaner body, right? So you're bringing your calories back up to your new estimated maintenance. And this is where having a coach comes into play, because they can help you figure that out if you're not sure what that is, just based on where you came from and where you started. And then also some calculations come into play there and things like that. And again, the main purpose with a diet break is a little bit different than a refeed, is to replenish hormones and to make sure we're preventing as much metabolic adaptation, or also known as adaptive thermogenesis, as we can, and also that mental benefit as well. So having a diet break is also going to give you, obviously, that psychological break from dieting, even more than just, a 1 or 2 day refeed. And again, so when we're talking about dieting or being in a deficit, you're eating fewer calories and getting leaner, right? That's the whole point of dieting. For most people, obviously. I feel like that if you go on a diet, you want to lose body fat and get leaner. So when you're doing this, your metabolism is adapting to that response, right? So you've probably heard the term, your metabolism slows down. I don't like to refer to it as that, but there are things that happen with your metabolism that occur because of being in this deficit, because of putting your body through this, right? So a few things are, one, your body, as you lose weight and as you lose body fat, you're just smaller. You're a smaller person. So this in itself causes your basal metabolic rate to decrease. Just because of the fact that you are a smaller human being, right? Your BMR is basically all the energy it takes to just do nothing. It's like your caloric expenditure for just literally sitting on the couch all day doing nothing. That would be considered your basal metabolic rate, or your resting metabolic rate. So that will decrease as you become a smaller person. Then also, if you think about it, you're eating less food. So the thermic effect of food decreases. Each macronutrient has their own thermic effect of food. We call that the TEF. And protein actually has the highest thermic effect of food. I'd actually dive into that in a blog article I wrote on, what was it called? I don't remember what it's called, but I will link it in the show notes, of course, as I'm doing for a lot of things in this episode. But I'll link that in the show notes, that blog post. It basically goes into the thermic effect of food and the differences between protein, fats, and carbs, and the importance of consuming higher protein, especially if you are in a deficit or if you are looking to lose body fat. Another thing to consider is your total energy expenditure, basically the total amount of quote unquote energy you burn or calories you burn throughout the day, decreases because, again, it takes fewer calories or energy to move your smaller body, right? That just makes sense. And then the next thing would be your NEAT, or your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, generally decreases with when you're in a deficit or you're in a fat loss phase. NEAT is basically just everything that you're doing. It's all your activity outside of general exercise. So walking, folding laundry, fidgeting, tapping your foot. It's like all these things that you don't necessarily do, you don't pay attention to. So it's like more subconscious. And due to the fact that your intake with your calories and your energy is lower when you're in a deficit or in a fat loss phase, that can cause you to feel more lethargic, have less energy, obviously, and basically it causes you to subconsciously just stop moving as much as you were before when you had more energy. And that, again, if you think about that logically, it makes sense. You have less energy coming in, so your body just, wants to adapt to that and wants to basically just do less, right? So this is where tracking steps and movement really comes into play and is very important when you are going through a fat loss phase or a deficit. And then lastly, we have to think about hormones as well. So hormones generally take a hit when you are in a calorie deficit and losing body fat. Specifically, a few of the hormones that take a hit, the ones that are most kind of talked about, are leptin decreases, and this can lead to increases in hunger and less energy expenditure or less energy output or energy out. Cortisol can also take a hit by, increasing due to the stress that you're putting your body under. So being in a diet or being in a deficit is a stress to your body. So cortisol can take a hit. Your thyroid hormones can take a hit. Sex hormones take a hit. There's a bunch of different hormones. Obviously, we have so many different ones, but these are the main ones that really do kind of get affected by being in a deficit. And that's why I say all the time, like, you can't always be in a calorie deficit. Like, you shouldn't be living your life in a deficit, because you'll have a lot of issues down the line if you're doing that. And that's where the education piece of it comes in. That's where tracking what you're doing comes in. That's where having a coach to help you with this comes in. That's why I have my own coach, and that's why I help coach other people. So all of these, there's so many different factors that you need to be aware of if you want to, I guess, diet properly and lose body fat properly, I guess is the way to say it. And to be able to sustain that long term, right? Because you don't want to just lose body fat and then gain it all back, right? You want to be able to sustain that for the long term. So that's just something to think about. And then just kind of the reverse of that, as you eat more, right, and you gain more body fat, the opposite happens. So your metabolism increases and your hunger decreases. This is the upregulation and downregulation of your metabolism. Just based off of dieting versus not dieting. And this is what we call, when I mentioned adaptive thermogenesis, which is also known as metabolic adaptation. I know those are big words, but that's just everything that I just mentioned. Those are all kind of part of what happens. So basically with a diet break, you're trying to dampen the effect on all of these adaptations that are occurring. So you can't stop these things from happening, because just like I said, like, if you're becoming a smaller person, if you're eating less, like, these things are happening. You can't necessarily stop them from happening, but there is potential to combat some of that. And that is where a diet break can come into play. And so with a diet break, you also have to understand that you're really just putting a pause on fat loss, right? So it's different than a refeed generally, because you're actually not in a deficit anymore. So that allows you to bring your calories back up to estimated maintenance and then be at that maintenance level for, however long the diet break is, whether it's a week or 2 weeks. And this can help dampen some of the negative effects that occur from, that adaptive thermogenesis or metabolic adaptation that occurs. Again, it can't stop it, but it may help to dampen some of those things, especially hormonal responses and things like that. Again, there's kind of limited research on all of this. There is some studies and a lot of anecdotal research, but it's still something that's such a newer concept that there's not tons of studies that have been done on this. So that's also something to think about as well. But I'm just kind of, giving you what I know based off of my research and my experience working with clients and my experience with myself as well. And something else too that we have to realize with a diet break and a refeed is that you're not regressing during this time. So it's something that a lot of people fear if they're, in a diet or fat loss phase. They kind of don't, for example, even for me, when I first took my first diet break with my coach, I was like, well, I don't want to do this because I have been seeing progress the last few months, why would I stop it, right? Why would I stop seeing that? Why would I want to stop seeing that progress? And really, it's not. It's part of the strategy, right? So you're just simply pausing where you're at. You're not regressing. So another thing to think about too is because you're consuming your maintenance intake or your new, estimated maintenance, which you should be, this shouldn't cause a ton of weight gain or a ton of fat gain, right? Like you shouldn't be gaining fat or gaining too much weight during the diet break. I will talk about this in a second because there was another question that came up in terms of, gaining weight during diet breaks, which I'll address in a second. But you're literally just putting the pause button on fat loss, and you should, be maintaining, right? You're at maintenance or you're at your new estimated maintenance. So you should be just maintaining and kind of just pressing that pause button on fat loss. So with diet breaks, they do have a much greater effect on your actual hormone levels and metabolism versus just those refeed days, which are just 1 to 2 days. And this simply is just due to the fact that you're increasing the time frame of that. So it's an increased time frame. And then you're also just not in a deficit, right? So not being in a deficit, increasing the time frame that you're at maintenance, this is where the benefit of a diet break comes in. And that's why diet breaks are more likely to affect your hormones and your metabolism more than just a refeed. Even if the refeed was above your calorie intake for the week, even though it was just 1 or 2 days, that probably doesn't affect your hormones too much. Again, with refeeds, the traditional way that they're implemented is to actually not bring you out of that deficit, your weekly deficit, and just kind of balance out. You're basically just, like I said, you're increasing your calories for that one day, but then maybe you're decreasing calories for the rest of the other days of the week. That's traditionally how I use it. There are people who use it to actually bring you out of the deficit for that one day. So there's different ways to implement these things, right? It depends on your goals and where you're coming from and, how you're basically progressing through the diet. And that's why this is all so individualized too, and why having a coach is super important for this, and someone who can, bring you or be with you along that journey. I think it's super important like I said, I have my own coach, and I just think it's important. So anyway, now I'm rambling off. But something to also think about is taking diet breaks can also lead to, and this is something big too that we need to think about. Taking, 1 to 2 week diet breaks can also lead to maintaining more lean muscle and gives you time to practice maintenance. So periods of practicing maintenance are important to prevent that yo-yo dieting that occurs for a lot of people, and actually continuing to implement habits that you've built to maintain this new kind of leaner body that you've accomplished. So that is important, and especially going back to the maintaining more lean muscle. Another thing I want to mention though is there are some recent studies that have come out on 2-day refeeds, helping to maintain muscle as well, compared to people who are just in a linear caloric deficit. So I will link those studies I actually talked in detail about those in the last episode. So again, if you want to learn more about this, definitely just check out the episode that I did where I took a deep dive into refeeds and diet breaks. But there have been studies that have been done. So you can actually look up the Matador study. That's one famous study that's been done on diet breaks. And then another recent one that came out was the Diet Break Diet Refeed study out of Bill Campbell's lab at the University of South Florida. So I went into details on that in the last episode, but definitely you can just Google those and check that out and see the results of those. So again, most commonly diet breaks last about 1 to 2 weeks, but it also depends on the individual and also the length of your fat loss phase and where you're coming from. So that's something to consider as well. And then the second part of this question is, do I increase carb ratio for a diet break? Okay, so this is a really great question, and this is something that I feel like there's no concrete answer to this. Again, it depends on the individual and where you're coming from, especially, and also what type of lifestyle you're following and what makes you feel best. So if you are following a strict keto low carb diet and you don't want to, consume a bunch of carbs because that just doesn't make you feel good, then maybe you do a refeed with, you do a fat refeed and you increase your fat or even increasing a little bit of protein. So The only thing I will say with this is there seems to be more research and more anecdotal evidence showing that a refeed or a diet break via increased carbs is more effective than increasing from protein and fat. And there's a few reasons for this, but it's mostly related to the hormones leptin and cortisol that we actually talked about a little while ago. And then also being able to refill those muscle glycogen stores via carbohydrates. But again, like it's individual. It's so individual and depends on where you're coming from. And the research is still not super, super consistent on this. So there is more research again on increasing carbohydrates as you're if you're implementing a refeed or a diet break, bringing your calories up via carbohydrates tends to be where people have seen the most, I guess, results or just the most positive results, especially with when we think about leptin and cortisol, and then again, refilling muscle glycogen stores. But leptin does seem to be mostly a product of calorie intake and then also your body fat levels. So I would say that if you want to try a refeed, if you are like on a strict ketogenic diet, and you want to try a refeed with just fat instead of carbs, I mean, try it out and see how you feel. I've personally done that in the past, and I didn't notice as much, I guess, positive as I did from implementing via carbs. But my friend Robert Sikes, who is the Keto Savage, he is an expert on fat refeed, so you should definitely check him out. He's at Keto Savage on Instagram, and then he has his own podcast, the Keto Savage podcast. So he is all about those fat refeeds. So again, it just kind of comes back to where you're coming from, and all of that. So hopefully that made sense. Personally, I do believe that the main benefits of a diet break come from the increase in calories in general. Not like overall, just if you do increase your calories, you're bringing yourself out of that deficit no matter what. So that's going to benefit you in that diet break for sure. Like no matter where those calories come from, that in itself will benefit you. I think kind of just being more precise with what you're doing. That's when it comes down to implementing whether it's coming from carbs or fats and really just kind of honing in on what makes you feel best. So again, check out that episode I did for more insights and also a deeper dive into all things refeeds and diet breaks. I will link that in the show notes. Okay, the next question, if I hit a weight loss stall, is it a good time for a diet break? So I would say not necessarily, but maybe, right? So it depends. It always all depends. But for my clients, I gauge when a diet break is needed based off of a few different factors. And it's mainly from biofeedback metrics that I assess with my clients that we track every single day. So the first thing would be diet fatigue. So if you're experiencing lack of adherence to the plan or to your macros and you're just not being compliant, that could be a sign of just overall diet fatigue, and it might be time to take a diet break. Another few metrics that we obviously look at are sleep quality. So if your sleep quality is starting to take a hit, that might be a sign. If you're constantly hungry and having cravings for multiple days straight, that could be a sign. And then if your performance and recovery are suffering significantly, that would be another sign that it might be time for a diet break. But again, we also have to realize too, like these things are probably going to suffer a little bit. The more you diet and are in, an aggressive deficit or in a deficit at all, especially if that is an aggressive deficit, then these things will take a hit. Like your sleep will probably take a hit. You're probably going to feel some hunger and cravings. That's kind of just all part of it. And your performance and recovery probably will also take a hit. That's just, again, coming back to not having as much energy and nutrients coming in, for your body, right? So these things will take a hit, but if they're kind of all, people talk about, what's the saying? It's like, if like shit's hitting the fan all at once, then that might be a sign that you need a diet break. So if your sleep quality is absolutely horrendous for several days straight and you're just hungry 24/7, cravings are out of this world, those are some signs. And then again, it also comes back to the timeline of your fat loss phase and your cut. And then also with diet breaks, I like to plan them around travel or vacations. So those are some other factors that I put into play when we talk about like what you're doing, what the long-term plan what the long-term plan is. So what is the timeline? What are we looking at? What are your goals? Do you have any travel or vacations coming up? Because that's the best time that I've seen to implement diet breaks, just because it makes things easier and allows you to enjoy yourself on those vacations. And obviously with traveling, you're not, cooking at home and things like that. So it's a little bit harder to know exactly what's in your food and all of that. So if you have, aside from diet breaks, if you have hit a weight loss or fat loss stall, I'd start by asking yourself a few questions first. The first one would be, are you tracking your weekly average weight, not just your daily fluctuations, right? So I talk about this all the time, but the daily fluctuations in the scale do not matter. That is everybody, no matter if you're a woman or a man, your scale will fluctuate day to day just based off, how much you're eating, in terms of like your sodium intake, your water intake, your stress levels, if you're having any digestive issues, your fiber intake, if it's the time of the month, if you're a woman. So these can all affect what the scale is doing from day to day. So I'd ask you to, consider if you're tracking the day-to-day fluctuations in your scale weight, or are you tracking your weekly average weight? Because that's what we want to be paying attention to. So if your weekly average weight is decreasing, right, from week to week, that is a sign that you are still losing fat. You're still losing body fat, and you just need to continue going the course, right? The next thing I would say, or that I would ask yourself, is, are your body measurements decreasing? So again, daily fluctuations in the scale are something that happen for everybody. And so that's why I generally don't like to just base everything off the scale. I think that's the worst thing you can do going into any diet or fat loss phase. Like, the scale should not be the only measurement you're taking. I think body tape measurements are the key to seeing your progress over time. Measurements can give you a much more accurate picture of your progress across the course of the week, and are also less prone, obviously, to fluctuations versus the scale. So one kind of thing that I would look at, if you've lost, I would say 1/4 of an inch or more off of multiple measurement sites, usually like off of 2 or 3 measurement sites, it's safe to say that you are still losing body fat. And this is why with all my clients, we do body tape measurements every single week consistently, and we track that and we make adjustments from there. So if that is the case, then you're still losing body fat and you just need to continue the course. You haven't hit a plateau yet. The next thing I would ask yourself is, has your hunger decreased, or did your progress just stop abruptly? So if you've been relatively hungry throughout this dieting or fat loss phase, we rate hunger on a scale of 1 to 5. So, between a 2.5 or 2.5 and 3 is generally normal in a fat loss phase, because again, you are going to have some hunger when you are in a deficit. If you suddenly see a large decrease in hunger without drastically increasing maybe the percentage of protein you're consuming, or just starting to consume more whole foods, it's likely that the calories have increased the calories you're consuming have increased, and you have to just adjust from that. So that would just be one thing to think about. It's probably due to just more calories coming in that you're maybe not aware of. So that's something you have to think about. So if your hunger has decreased and your progress has just stopped abruptly, think about that, because that could be one sign that maybe you're not in a deficit anymore. And that could be one of the reasons why you've experienced a fat loss stall. So that's another thing to consider. Another question you can ask yourself is, are you consistently hitting your macros, and are you consistently tracking your macros? So this comes back to the whole awareness piece of it, which I talk about all the time, just being aware of how much you're consuming and what you're consuming. So are you tracking all of your meals, all of the days of the week? And are you tracking even those licks, nibbles, and bites? Those things can add up over the course of the day and over the course of the week. Are you tracking, what you're cooking your food in? So if you're using different oils to cook your food in, are you tracking those oils? Are you tracking the different condiments you're using? Are you tracking alcohol? Alcohol has calories. It's its own macro. There's 7 calories per gram of alcohol. So if you're not tracking that, that can be one of the reasons that things have stalled. And then are you measuring your food accurately? So are you estimating your portion sizes, or are you actually measuring them? Do you have a food scale? Those are things that we have to ask ourselves, especially if we are, we have specific goals and maybe we've hit a quote unquote plateau or are not seeing the continued progress that we'd be expecting, right? So you got to ask yourself these things. And then also, are you getting too flexible with the foods that you're consuming? So are you getting too flexible with foods that are harder to track accurately? So there's nothing wrong with, going out to eat and going to restaurants and things like that. That's part of life, right? But if you're eating foods that you didn't prepare on a, regular basis, you're always leaving more room for error, right? So if you're, you'll never know exactly what's in the food that you're consuming if you're eating out at a restaurant. So even if your macros look perfect in your tracker based off the estimations you've made, if you're eating out too frequently, it can still lead to underestimating the amount that you're actually consuming. So that's something to think about. Not saying that you can never eat out at restaurants during a fat loss phase, but it also comes back to what your goals are and how strict and how fast you want to see that progress being made. So the more you eat out at restaurants, the more often you're going to be guessing and estimating, right? And so the less accurate you're going to be versus if you are preparing the food yourself, you know exactly what's going into it. And it's a lot easier to track. The last thing I would ask yourself, or second to last thing I would ask yourself, is are you hitting your daily movement goal? So do you have a step goal? This would be considered your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So when dieting, again, you're depriving your body of energy or calories. So you're becoming more lethargic. This can result in less daily movement. So step goals and increasing exercise can help, but a decrease in calories burned is really inevitable here. So you have to just make sure that you're aware of this. As you diet, movement will likely decrease and reduce, like we talked about. We can't always account for, the amount of fidgeting and, tapping of our foot that we're doing. But if we do have a movement goal and a step goal, it's a lot easier to track that throughout the day. So if you know that you have to hit a specific amount of steps per day and you're not hitting that goal, then that's something that we have to look into too. So movement is a huge piece of the puzzle that a lot of people miss. And it's something that with all of my clients and with myself, I always track steps, especially if the goal is fat loss, because we can manipulate those steps up and down depending on the progress you're seeing. And that obviously goes into your overall caloric expenditure throughout the day. So that's something that you should really be aware of as well. And then lastly, I would say related to diet breaks, have you taken a diet break in the last 12 weeks or 3 months? So if you've been dieting straight for, over 3 months, then it's probably, and you've hit kind of that plateau that you mentioned, and all of these other things that I just mentioned are in check, then it's probably time for a diet break. Again, this is where having a coach comes into play to help you with maneuvering all of these things, right? So if you have a specific goal and you want to hit that goal as fast as possible, obviously as sustainable as possible, while still being able to sustain the results long term, having a coach to help you with this is very important. I can tell you that firsthand from my experience for when I went through my own transformation. And I mean, anybody who's ever gone through a fat loss phase or a cut or a diet or whatever it may be, and you've had a coach helping you along the way, I'm sure they can tell you that they had a lot more success versus when they just tried to do it alone. So again, that's super important to think about. And then lastly, the last question is, what weight fluctuations or weight gain can one expect from doing a 2-week diet break at maintenance? Okay, so this kind of goes back to what I mentioned before, but with weight gain during a 2-week diet break, you'll likely see the scale go up slightly, especially if you're doing a 2-week diet break, but it's nothing to freak out about. It's normal. Your body is just likely holding on to more water, especially if you are increasing your calories from carbohydrates. We know that carbs hold on to water in the body. So that could be one of the reasons why you're just increasing the kind of, like I said, you're just increasing the amount of water that your body's holding on to. You've also increased the amount of food you're eating. So the content of that food in your gut, right, is just more. So it's increased. So you just basically have more food in your gut, maybe more fiber, things like that. So that could cause the scale to go up a little bit. And it doesn't mean that you're gaining fat, right? That's not what it means. If calories are at your new maintenance, right, you won't gain fat because you're just maintaining. Again, this is where having a coach helps to kind of help you figure this out, right? And the other thing I would say with this too is with a diet break or refeed or anything like that, you need to be strategic about the food choices that you are choosing during the diet break or refeed. One of the biggest mistakes that people make is thinking that a diet break is just a time to basically ramp up calorically dense foods or start eating more processed and packaged foods. You don't want to do that because that can lead to basically eating more than you should. They're also all calorically dense foods and packaged processed foods are more hyperpalatable, so they're a lot easier to eat more of, obviously. So you want to stick mostly to the food that you've been eating normally, right? And just increase the quantities. That's basically what you want to do. Obviously, if you're increasing carbs, you want to do that from more whole food sources. Like I mentioned, fruits, potatoes, rice, squash, things like that. When you try to work in, like I mentioned, when you try to work in too many calorically dense foods and, processed or quote unquote flexible foods, you can definitely eat more calories and also be less satisfied and satiated than when you were consuming, obviously, whole food sources or consuming the foods that you're eating on the diet. So again, you just want to increase the amount of food you're consuming during that diet break, but you don't want to completely shift to, eating tons of foods at restaurants or packaged foods or going out and getting a big cone of ice cream. I don't know. And I'm not saying this is another thing too that you have to realize, right? You have to know yourself too. So if you say you're taking this diet break during a vacation, so say you're taking a 2-week diet break during a vacation and you want to enjoy that vacation and maybe you want to, have a few flexible foods or you want to have a scoop of ice cream or, a cupcake or something like that. I'm not saying you can't do that, but you don't want to be doing that every single day and completely changing around the types of foods you're eating because again, a diet break isn't just a free for all. You should still be tracking and, if you still have a goal in mind, you want to be able to sustain that goal, right? Or sustain where you're at. You can't just be, consuming whatever you want, right? And that's just in general too. If you think about what you're going to be doing after the quote unquote diet's over, you can't just go back to what you were doing before because you will just gain back all the weight from what you were doing before. If you go back into bad habits, you have to keep the habits that you've made throughout the dieting phase, focusing on more whole foods, focusing on your movement, things like that. Like all these habits that you've built up, these habits are what are going to help you sustain that fat loss and sustain that leaner body for the rest of your life. So if you are, if you head into a diet break and you're just consuming a whole bunch of crap and not paying attention, then that is definitely not going to be advantageous for your goals. So again, this isn't just a time where you eat whatever you want and you don't track it. You need to continue to think about your end goal and realize that just because it's a diet break, it doesn't mean it's a break from focusing on your specific goal. It's part of the process to achieve that goal, like I mentioned. And so you have to be strategic about what you're doing. You have to be aware. And you have to also have someone maybe who holds you accountable for what you're doing and can give you advice for this. So hopefully that makes sense. Those are all the questions we have for today. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please, leave a review on iTunes. You can share it out on Instagram and tag me. My handle is at rachelgregory.cns. And yeah, that's all I got for you for today. I love recording these episodes, so please always send me your questions. I generally post a question box on my Instagram story on Mondays, sometimes Tuesdays if I forget. So definitely look out for that for future Q&A episodes. All right, I will see you next time.